Hello everybody and welcome to Insider's Guide. Today we're wrapping up our discussion of Aspen Snowmass. With Snowmass there's a lot to talk about, so this Insider's Guide is split into 3 parts. In this part we'll cover the 2 most challenging zones at the resort, the Cirque and Hanging Valley. If you haven't already, go check out parts A and B to get some great background on Snowmass and learn about the rest of the mountain. So with that, let's continue in Insider's Guide to Ski Resorts, Snowmass. As promised from last episode, we'll start with the Cirque terrain that's lappable via the Sheer Bliss lift. With a few exceptions, the Cirque is generally not as extreme as the Hanging Valley stuff. However, it's still much harder than anything you'll find elsewhere at the resort. The terrain here is steep and rocky, so be extra mindful of your equipment. A good rule of thumb for the Cirque is that if you don't see any tracks, don't go. There are some really nasty sharks in places where you'd least expect it. The Cirque terrain is surprisingly very well marked with clear signage marking the start of various runs, which is refreshing for terrain of this caliber. While the Cirque primarily consists of high alpine bowl terrain, the trails accessed off Sheer Bliss are more below treeline. All of these runs are accessed by skiing the Sheer Bliss trail and heading as far skiers right as possible. From there, hug the boundary lines and look for the gates that correspond to each of these runs. While it is possible to reach Goudy's from Sheer Bliss, because the traverse is pretty uphill, I'd just ride up the Cirque platter. KT Gully is a great place to start in the Cirque. It's a mogul chute that's bounded by rocks on the skier's right and aspen trees on the skier's left. It's not that narrow or long, but it maintains a steep pitch and is definitely worth checking out. Sun Kiss is the grove of aspens right next to KT Gully. This zone is actually a good bit steeper than KT Gully, especially at the entrance. Conditions here can also be a bit hit or miss, so this is an area I'd only recommend checking after a fresh dump. Rock Island is a really unique part of the Cirque. As its name suggests, this run is covered in rocks, which makes for some fantastic pillows. There are 2 primary entrances into Rock Island. The first one typically requires a 20-foot drop and is accessed straight out of the gate. The second entrance bypasses the first entrance and is just skiers left of it. Unless conditions are fantastic, I definitely recommend the second entrance. Even past the entrance, there are still plenty of opportunities for some great pillows. Burn Cliffs is arguably the most extreme zone at Aspen Snowmass and is home to 40+ foot drops. It's extremely hard to find for a reason, and unless you're a professional, I'd recommend avoiding it. Buckskin is a very steep glade area. Because it's located towards the end of the Cirque, it's seldom skied and can be home to some excellent untracked stashes. Buckskin cliffs are exactly what they sound like, and while they aren't as extreme as the Burn Cliffs, they're definitely to be avoided unless conditions are prime. Hang-Ons is a very short but very steep and rocky glade run. All of these runs filter onto a gladed and narrow drainage, so I'd be careful with your speed. This drainage brings you right back to the Sheer Bliss lift. The remainder of the Cirque is only accessible via the Cirque platter. This lift can generate some significant lines due to misloads, but if you want to ski the Cirque from the top, this is the only way. Before we talk about the Cirque itself, let's talk about the 2 intermediate runs accessed off this lift. Rocky Mountain High is a great groomed cruiser that offers some of the best views at the resort. This is actually one of the mellower blues at the resort. The one downside is that during poor weather, this run can be pretty tough for the average intermediate rider due to its above treeline nature. Nonetheless, if the weather is nice, this is a must-do for intermediates. The other blue run, High Pass, is not as great. It basically serves as a way to get over to the high alpine lift and skip the small skate hike needed to access the Hanging Valley. That honestly makes lapping the Hanging Valley more painful in my opinion, so I avoid it. It's also not a great run all around, so I wouldn't recommend it to true intermediates. Long story short, just stick to Rocky Mountain High. Alright, now let's get to the runs in the main part of the Cirque. As previously mentioned, the Cirque is a large, wide open, and varied bowl zone. While it doesn't really maintain a consistent pitch, it's a pretty unique area given the several undulations in the bowl. Oftentimes, you'll be skiing a pitch before it flattens out, and then you reach another pitch. This pattern repeats throughout the entire bowl, but of course, your experience varies based on the gate that you take. We'll start with the most traveled entrance, known as Cirque Headwall. Unlike what the trail map depicts, the gate to the Cirque Headwall is located smack dab in the middle of the bowl. Although Cirque Headwall is the most traveled way into the Cirque, it's a classic run that's worth doing at least once. This is one of the few runs in the Cirque that I'd say is suitable for proficient advanced riders, assuming reasonable conditions. It's pretty wide open and doesn't feature too many obstacles until you reach the drainage. Like the other Cirque runs, however, you do need to watch out for sharks. From top to bottom, this run is about 2 miles, so make sure to take plenty of breaks. Don't be fooled, even Snowmass's extremes are incredibly long. If you drop in just a bit beyond Cirque Headwall, you'll reach East Wall. I'm not a big fan of this area since it always seems to be rockier than the main entrance, but if there's been a recent dump, by all means check it out. Cirque Cornice is a short but super gnarly entrance into the Cirque. The run is basically what it sounds like, a large cornice drop over a moderately sized cliff band. A common mistake with these types of drops is to try and stop immediately after landing. To do this successfully, you need to be willing to ride it out for a while. If you're uncomfortable doing that, try a different line. To access Little Headwall and Ptarmigan, you'll have to ski down the Cirque a little bit before reaching the gates. Little Headwall and Ptarmigan are just lookers' ride of Cirque Cornice. These runs are pretty similar to the Cirque Headwall but aren't anything too special. Both AMF and Goudies require you to ski down Rocky Mountain High and stay skiers right until you reach their respective gates. AMF is an expletive acronym for a really fun and steep little chute. This is a good one to check out if you're progressing because you can really easily bail onto Ptarmigan by cutting skiers left. Goudies is one of the more challenging entrances into the Cirque, although it's not as extreme as Cirque Cornice. The entrance is usually corniced, and beyond that, it maintains a very steep pitch all the way to the bottom. There is a significant amount of unmarked terrain between Goudies and KT Gully. This area is extremely gnarly, with most paths down requiring a sizable cliff drop. There are a few slots in the cliff band that can be straight-lined if conditions permit. As we previously talked about, all the Cirque runs filter into a gladed and narrow drainage that's essentially a frozen creek, although if you stick more skiers right, you can ski Cirque Dikes, a gladed area that often holds fantastic stashes. I do prefer doing this, since the skier's left drainage tends to get skied out really fast. Either way, you'll end up at the sheer Bliss Lift, which you can take up and ski to the Cirque platter from for another lap in this epic area. Okay, that about does it for the Cirque. Let's now move on to the Hanging Valley. The Hanging Valley, in my opinion, is overall a more challenging zone than the Cirque. On average, the entrances into it are a lot more technical than over at the Cirque, and the runs here feel a lot longer. The primary way of accessing this zone comes from the High Alpine Lift. Possible, Baby Ruth, Hanging Valley Glades, Weird Woods, Willys, Glade 1 through 3, and Waters are all accessible right off the lift. The remaining runs require a short walk from the top terminal of the lift. It takes about 5 minutes to reach Roberto's and a little bit more to reach the other entrances above it. Everything above Roberto's is known as the Hanging Valley Headwall. In general, Hanging Valley lines start off with a chute entrance. From there, based on where you entered the zone, you'll either be funneled into the Hanging Valley Glades or the Hanging Valley Wall. Generally, the higher entrances lead to the Hanging Valley Wall and the lower entrances lead to the Hanging Valley Glades, although you can get to the Hanging Valley Glades from every entrance. If you're limited on time, I'd try to do at least one run through both. In general, signage in the Hanging Valley is still good, but just due to the sheer scale of this zone, getting to specific areas can be super confusing. The Hanging Valley is an absolutely massive amount of terrain, and there are so many different paths and stashes which leads to no two runs feeling exactly the same. I'm not going to be able to cover all the different routes, so expect the unexpected in the entire zone. Let's first start with all the entrances accessible right off the High Alpine Lift. From the top terminal, ski towards the edge and hug the skier's right boundary line until you start seeing the gates. Possible is the first gate you'll come across, and it's a super gnarly and narrow chute. This is arguably the toughest marked entrance into the Hanging Valley. The trail's difficulty is heavily dependent on snow. If it's been a poor snow year, you're in for an ultra narrow corridor that might even require a straight line. If it's been an average to good snow year, then the chute just requires some really precise jump turns. It's not uncommon for there to be rocks in the gut of the chute, which just cranks up the difficulty a notch. Unfortunately, Possible seems to be the least consistently opened entrance into the Hanging Valley. With all that being said, this is a super fun chute that's totally worth checking out if it's open during your visit. Baby Ruth is a rocky chute in the trees. It's a bit tough to describe, but it'll make sense once you see it. While it's not as tough as Possible, it's still a fairly challenging entrance that demands some very precise turns. These two chutes filter onto Weird Woods and then later Willys, Glade 1 through 3, or Waters based on where you end up on your run. A creek separates Hanging Valley Glades and Weird Woods, but it's usually filled in during the course season. Speaking of which, Hanging Valley Glades has its own dedicated entrance a bit further down the edge. It's not as challenging as the aforementioned chutes, but in the early season, there can be several mandatory drops based on which path you select. If you go too far skiers left, you'll merge onto Cookies, but you can hike for about 5 minutes to reach the top of Waters. Willys and Glade 1 through 3 are generally steeper than Waters, all of which are basically short mogul runs. All of this tree terrain that we've discussed is hands down the best at the resort, outside of the Burnt Mountain Glades. Now let's talk about the terrain that you'll have to work a little extra to reach. The walk is totally worth it, as you get to access some even more unique terrain through it. Roberto's is the easiest and most prominent entrance into the Hanging Valley. It's a super wide chute bounded by two large cliff bands that's akin to Zoot Chute at Breckenridge, if you know that. In lower snow years, the chute can have some rocks and shrubs that amplify the difficulty a bit. Overall though, this is a really fun classic entrance into the Hanging Valley. Roberto's most naturally filters into the Frog Pond Glades. From there, if you continue straight, you'll reach the lower half of Hanging Valley Wall. If you go skiers left, you'll reach the Weird Woods and the rest of the runs we just talked about. We'll talk more about the Hanging Valley Wall once we've finished talking about the remaining entrances. Everything above Roberto's is known as the Hanging Valley Headwall. The headwall consists of some of the most extreme entrances into the Hanging Valley. From Roberto's, these entrances only take a bit of extra walking. The West 1 and 2 gate is the most prominent entrance into the headwall. If you enter the gate and traverse skiers left a bit, you'll see a sign for a run called Roberto's Double, or simply just Double. If you watch a lot of skiing on YouTube, you might have seen this infamous and hilarious video of the chute pop up on your recommended at some point. In all seriousness though, Roberto's Double is significantly more challenging than Roberto's and is one of the more extreme entrances into the Hanging Valley. It's not typically open unless it's been a great snow year, and there can be a mandatory exit air based on conditions. Going back to West 1 and 2, the main run in this area is Hutchinson's Alley, which is straight from the gate. Hutchinson's Alley is one of the few skiable lines through this rocky area that's considered the West 1 and 2 terrain. In worse conditions, this run can mandate an exit straight line. Otherwise, it's not too terribly challenging, but should definitely be treated with caution. Just skiers right of the West 1 and 2 gate is the gate to the Hanging Valley Headwall's namesake run, Headwall. This area is very similar to West 1 and 2. Skiers right of Headwall is the unmarked East 1 and 2 area. This is actually one of the mellower entrances into the Hanging Valley, and it consists of a steep but lightly graded face. If you walk all the way to the boundary line, you can reach the unmarked Adios Ridge, which goes directly above Hanging Valley Headwall. You can continue to traverse down that ridge, but eventually you'll need to drop a cornice to enter the Hanging Valley. If you continue to hug the boundary line from Adios Ridge, you'll eventually reach Upper and Lower Ladder, two of the most remote runs at Snowmass, the first lines down the Hanging Valley Wall. As you can already probably see, which line you take into the Hanging Valley dictates where on the Hanging Valley Wall you'll end up at. Due to the complexity of reaching it, the Hanging Valley Wall is often home to some of the best stashes at Snowmass. The best way to scope it out is honestly the view from Elk Camp Lift, since it's pretty hidden from all other parts of the resort. From Adios Ridge, you can continue down Upper and Lower Ladder, or traverse skiers left and drop in at any point along the Hanging Valley Wall. Upper Ladder goes right next to an absolutely gigantic pyramid-shaped cliff band, so it's crucial that you don't fall there. Lower Ladder is much lower consequence and is often home to some incredible snow. If you want a spicier alternative to Lower Ladder, then from the bottom of Upper Ladder, cut skiers right to a hidden chute known as Medusa. This is the only skiable line down the aforementioned cliff band. Even in good conditions, the chute is often littered with obstacles and could even require an exit air. There's also a bunch of cliffs around this chute, so ending up in the right place is critical. Due to the complexity of finding it and the consequences of missing it, I'd honestly recommend finding a local to do this one with you if it's your first time. The remainder of the Hanging Valley Wall isn't nearly as extreme as Medusa, but is still plenty steep. Unlike its poor depiction on the trail map, the Hanging Valley Wall is more of a large wide open face with several different routes down. This area is ever so slightly graded and has a few fun pillows based on the route you take. We just talked about Lower Ladder, so we'll move on to Rayburn's, which is right next to it. Rayburn's is a touch more densely graded in spots than Lower Ladder, but is less steep. Big Spruce, Valley, and Wall 1 cover the steepest part of the face and are my favorite spots on the Hanging Valley Wall. Around Wall 1, there are a few large cliff drops if you know where to look. Wall 2, Strawberry Patch, Cassidy's, and Union are not as interesting in my opinion, and tend to get tracked out faster than the previous runs we just discussed. Past the steepest part of the face, all of the Hanging Valley Wall runs filter into some really nice and mellow glades before bringing you onto the bottom of Sandy Park. On that subject, no matter which path you take down the Hanging Valley, you'll eventually merge onto either the lower half of Sandy Park if you're coming from the Hanging Valley Wall, or directly onto Turkey Trot if you're coming from the Hanging Valley Glades. As we talked about in Part A, Sandy Park eventually merges onto Turkey Trot, which is ultra flat, so try to retain your speed. Ski past the Elk Camp area and take Adams Avenue all the way back to the Alpine Springs lift. Ride up the Alpine Springs lift and then the High Alpine lift to get back to the start of the zone. If you really want to skip the walk required to get to the entrances from Roberto's and higher, you can technically ski down to Sheer Bliss, ride it up, take the Cirque platter, and ski High Pass. However, as we previously discussed, this is horribly inefficient and it's way faster to just suck it up and do the brief walk. Alright, that about wraps it up for Aspen Snowmass. If you haven't already, go check out Part A and B to hear about the rest of Snowmass, or go check out another episode of Insider's Guide, all about other fine resorts around the West. As always, please leave any questions down below. Thank you all so much for watching. All my love, I'm out.